The moment I saw Sharon's neon pink jacket through my frost-covered kitchen window at 6 in the morning, I knew my day was about to go downhill fast. I stood there in my boxer shorts and old college sweatshirt, coffee mug halfway to my lips, watching this woman I'd never spoken to more than twice march across the snow-dusted cul-de-sac toward my driveway. My 2019 Ford F-150 sat there running, exhaust puffing white clouds into the frigid January air. It was 14 degrees outside in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, and I'd started my truck exactly 7 minutes earlier to let it warm up before my commute to the construction site. Sharon Patterson, HOA board president and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, looked like she was leading a one-woman crusade against everything she deemed offensive. Her platinum blonde bob barely moved in the bitter wind as she stood next to my truck, holding up her phone. She was filming it. Actually filming my truck as it sat there in my own driveway. I set down my coffee and pulled on the jeans I'd left draped over the kitchen chair. By the time I got my boots on and stepped outside, she'd moved even closer to my truck, her phone now pointed at the exhaust pipe. "Can I help you?" I called out, my breath visible in the cold air. She spun around, her expression shifting from concentrated documentation to righteous indignation. "Mr. Griffin Ortega, do you have any idea how long your vehicle has been idling?" "About 7 minutes," I said, walking down my front steps. "It's 14 degrees. I'm warming it up before I drive to work." The HOA bylaws clearly state that excessive noise and air pollution are violations of community standards, Sharon said, clutching her phone like it was a sacred text. "Your truck has been spewing toxic fumes into our neighborhood air. It's a truck, in winter. This is what people do. Not in Meadowbrook Estates, they don't." She tapped something on her phone. "I'm documenting this violation and submitting it to the board. You'll be receiving a formal notice within 5 business days." I stared at her, genuinely confused about whether this was really happening. "You're reporting me for warming up my truck in my own driveway." "I'm reporting you for violating community standards regarding air quality and excessive idling. There are laws about this, you know. Environmental regulations." "Madam, it's my truck, my driveway, and I'm not breaking any laws. We'll see what the board has to say about that." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her house, the second largest home in our development. The woman had moved in 8 months ago and immediately gotten herself elected to the HOA board during some meeting I'd skipped because I was working late. I got in my truck, which was finally warm enough that the heater actually worked, and headed to the job site. The whole drive, I kept thinking about Sharon standing there filming my truck like she'd caught me dealing drugs or something. It was absurd. People all over Ohio warmed up their vehicles in winter. It was practically a state tradition. The construction site that morning was a new commercial development off I-271, and the crew was already complaining about the cold before I even stepped out of my truck. I was a site supervisor for Morrison Construction, which meant I spent my days making sure projects stayed on schedule and dealing with problems. Real problems, like equipment failures and permit issues and weather delays, not made-up problems invented by HOA board members. "You look annoyed," said Tommy, my assistant foreman, as I walked past the temporary office trailer. "HOA nonsense," I said. "Don't get me started." But of course, Tommy wanted to hear the story, and by lunch break, half the crew was laughing about Sharon filming my truck. Most of them had similar stories about HOAs in their neighborhoods. Kevin talked about getting fined for leaving his basketball hoop on the curb overnight. Marcus mentioned a warning letter about his mailbox being the wrong shade of black. "That's why I rent," Tommy said, biting into his sandwich. No HOA, no property taxes, somebody else's problem when something breaks. Yeah, but you're paying someone else's mortgage, I said. I bought the house for equity. The HOA came with it, unfortunately. I'd purchased my 3-bedroom ranch in Meadowbrook Estates 2 years ago, right after my divorce from Jennifer was finalized. It was a decent neighborhood in Shaker Heights, close to work, good schools even though I didn't have kids, and the houses were well maintained. The HOA fees were $100 a month, which seemed reasonable for snow removal on the streets and maintenance of the small community park. I'd read through the bylaws when I bought the place, mostly standard stuff about keeping your lawn mowed and not painting your house purple. Nowhere in those bylaws did I remember anything about not warming up your vehicle. 5 days later, true to Sharon's word, I found an official HOA violation notice in my mailbox. The letter was printed on fancy cream-colored paper with the Meadowbrook Estates logo at the top, a little tree and house design that probably cost them way too much money. The letter stated that on January 12th at approximately 6:05 a.m., I had violated Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the community bylaws regarding excessive noise and environmental pollution from vehicle idling. I was being fined $150, payable within 30 days. If I wished to contest the violation, I could attend the next HOA board meeting on February 3rd at 7 p.m. I read the letter 3 times, standing there in my kitchen with my coat still on. Then I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws from the file box in my office closet and found Section 8, Paragraph 3. Residents shall maintain appropriate noise levels and shall not create excessive disturbances that interfere with the peaceful enjoyment of other residents. This includes but is not limited to loud music, construction noise outside permitted hours, and excessive vehicle noise. There was nothing specific about idling, nothing about emissions or environmental pollution. Sharon had interpreted a vague noise clause to include my truck warming up in the morning. I called my neighbor, Ed, who lived 2 doors down and had been in Meadowbrook Estates for 15 years. Ed was retired military, a straight shooter who'd warned me when I moved in that the HOA had gotten a little power-hungry in recent years. Sharon's been on a tear lately, Ed said when I explained the situation. She tried to fine the Martins for having a wreath on their door past January 10th. Said seasonal decorations had to come down within a week of the holiday. Had to show her that the bylaws specifically said January 15th. So she just makes stuff up. She interprets things in whatever way gives her the most authority, Ed said. Best advice. Show up to that meeting with your documentation. Bring the bylaws, bring whatever proof you need that you weren't doing anything wrong. It's my truck in my driveway. I shouldn't need proof. You're not wrong, but that's not how Sharon operates. She's convinced she's protecting property values. In her mind, anyone who doesn't follow her vision of the perfect neighborhood is a threat. I thanked Ed and spent the next hour reading through the entire HOA bylaws document. It was 47 pages of mostly reasonable rules about property maintenance, architectural changes, and community behavior. The idling thing wasn't there. Sharon had stretched the interpretation so far it was meaningless. Over the next 3 weeks, I kept warming up my truck every morning. Partly because it was still freezing cold and partly because I wasn't about to let Sharon's made-up violation change my routine. Each time I did it, I wondered if she was watching from her window, filming me again, building her case like she was prosecuting a federal crime. I also did my research. Ohio law had some regulations about idling, but they were specific to commercial vehicles and school buses, or vehicles idling for more than 5 minutes in certain circumstances. My personal truck, idling for under 10 minutes in my own driveway didn't violate any state or local laws. I printed out the relevant statutes and highlighted the parts that proved my point. Then I went further. I found information about EPA emissions standards and looked up my truck specifications. The F-150 was less than 6 years old, had passed its last emissions test with flying colors, and was well maintained. I'd kept all my service records, and I scheduled another emissions test at a certified facility in Cleveland just to have current documentation. The technician at the testing center, a guy named Rick with grease-stained hands and a friendly smile, looked confused when I explained why I needed the test. "Your registration doesn't require testing for another year," he said, checking his computer. "I know. I need it for an HOA issue." Rick shook his head. "Man, I hear some wild HOA stories, but this might top them. Lady thinks your truck is polluting the neighborhood. Apparently my idling is an environmental catastrophe." The test took about 20 minutes. Rick ran my truck through every emissions check they had, measuring carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides, and carbon dioxide levels. Everything came back well within acceptable limits. In fact, Rick said my truck was running cleaner than a lot of newer vehicles he tested. "You maintain this thing well," he said, handing me the printed results. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. This truck is in great shape." I paid for the test and left with my documentation. The sheet showed every measurement, every standard, and every passing grade. My truck wasn't just acceptable, it was exemplary. February 3rd arrived with another cold snap, temperatures dropping into single digits. I dressed in nice jeans and a button-down shirt, gathered my folder of documentation, and drove to the community center where HOA meetings were held. The community center was a small building near the park, funded by HOA dues and used for neighborhood events. When I walked in at 7 p.m., about 15 residents were already seated in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the board members sat. Sharon was center position, naturally, flanked by 2 other board members I recognized but had never met. To her left was a thin man in his 60s wearing a cardigan, and to her right was a younger woman, maybe early 40s, in business attire. Ed was already there, sitting in the back row. He nodded at me as I took a seat near the middle. A few other neighbors I recognized by sight filled out the rest of the audience. Sharon called the meeting to order with a gavel tap that seemed way too enthusiastic. She went through standard business items, reading minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for spring landscaping, and addressing a request from a resident who wanted to install a fence. Finally, she got to violations and disputes. "We have one contested violation this evening," Sharon said, looking directly at me. "Mr. Griffin Ortega, case number 2024-118, regarding vehicle idling and environmental pollution." I stood up, folder in hand. "Yes, I'm here to contest the violation. Please come forward and state your case." I walked to the front, feeling like I was in traffic court. I received a violation notice for warming up my truck in my driveway on the morning of January 12th. The notice claimed I violated Section 8, Paragraph 3 regarding excessive noise and environmental pollution. Sharon's expression was already set in disapproval. "You were observed allowing your vehicle to idle for an extended period, creating noise and releasing emissions into the community environment. First, I wasn't violating any noise ordinances. It was 6 in the morning, and my truck is a standard vehicle that doesn't produce excessive noise. Second, there's nothing in Section 8, Paragraph 3 about vehicle emissions or idling." I opened my folder and pulled out my copy of the bylaws, reading the exact wording aloud. It mentions noise disturbances, but warming up a vehicle isn't a noise disturbance. People all over Ohio do this every winter morning. The spirit of the rule clearly encompasses environmental concerns, Sharon said. Excessive idling contributes to poor air quality. The bylaws don't mention air quality or idling anywhere. You're interpreting something that isn't written. The man in the cardigan leaned forward. I'm Bob Sullivan, board treasurer. Mrs. Patterson, do we have specific language about vehicle idling? Sharon's jaw tightened. The environmental impact falls under community standards. We have a responsibility to maintain the quality of our neighborhood, which includes air quality. But that's not what the bylaws say, I countered. I'm not disputing that you want to maintain standards. I'm saying you can't fine people for things that aren't actually rules. I pulled out my next document. Furthermore, I had my truck tested at a certified emissions facility. Here are the results. My vehicle passes every emissions standard, well within acceptable limits. There's no environmental violation occurring. I handed the emissions test results to Bob, who studied them carefully. Sharon tried to look uninterested, but I could see her eyes tracking the paper as Bob read. These results show your truck is actually very clean, Bob said. Below the threshold for concerns. That's not the point, Sharon interrupted. The point is that excessive idling wastes fuel and creates unnecessary emissions, regardless of whether the vehicle technically passes a test. And my point is that the bylaws don't prohibit this. You can't fine people based on your personal environmental opinions when the rules don't back you up. The woman on the other side of Sharon spoke up. I'm Linda Martinez, board secretary. Mr. Ortega makes a valid argument. We can only enforce the rules as written, not as interpreted for specific situations. Sharon looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. We have discretion in interpreting the bylaws to protect community interests. You have discretion within reason, Bob said. But if the language doesn't support the violation, we can't uphold the fine. That puts the HOA at risk for legal challenge. It was 7 minutes, I added. I let my truck warm up for 7 minutes in 14-degree weather before driving to work. That's reasonable behavior that doesn't violate any written rule. Sharon shuffled her papers. The board will discuss this matter and issue a decision. With respect, I'd like a decision tonight, I said. I took time off work to be here. The violation is either valid or it isn't, and based on the bylaws, it isn't. Bob and Linda exchanged glances. Linda picked up the bylaws document and reread Section 8, Paragraph 3. After a long moment, she looked at Sharon. I don't think we can uphold this violation, Linda said quietly. The language isn't there. We can amend the bylaws to include specific idling restrictions, Sharon said. Sure, but we can't retroactively fine someone for a rule that doesn't exist yet, Bob said. That's not how this works. Sharon's face had gone red, but she maintained her composure. Fine. The board votes to dismiss the violation for case 2024-118. Mr. Ortega, you will not be fined. Thank you, I said, gathering my papers. However, Sharon continued, her voice sharp, I will be proposing an amendment to the bylaws to address vehicle idling at next month's meeting. This is a legitimate environmental and quality of life concern. That's your right, I said. But until such an amendment passes, residents should be free to warm up their vehicles. I returned to my seat, and Ed gave me a subtle thumbs up. The meeting continued with other business, but I could feel Sharon's eyes on me every few minutes. She was not happy about being contradicted in front of the board and the residents. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached me in the parking lot. Good for you, standing up to her, said a woman I recognized from 3 streets over. She tried to fine us for having a flower pot that was supposedly the wrong color. "She's getting ridiculous," added another man. "Someone needs to push back." Ed walked with me to my truck. "You handled that well. Professional, prepared, didn't get emotional." "I shouldn't have had to do any of this," I said. "It's common sense." "Common sense isn't common in HOA politics," Ed said. "Watch yourself, though. Sharon doesn't forget challenges to her authority. She'll be looking for other things to ding you on. Let her look. I follow the rules." But Ed's warning proved prophetic faster than I expected. 2 weeks after the meeting, I received another violation notice. This time, the alleged offense was that my garbage cans were visible from the street after collection hours. According to the notice, Section 11, Paragraph 6 required garbage cans to be stored out of sight when not in use for collection. I looked at the date and time stamp on the photo Sharon had included with the violation notice. The photo showed my cans at the end of my driveway at 4:37 p.m. on a Thursday. Collection day was Thursday, with trucks running anytime between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. in my neighborhood. My cans were sitting exactly where they needed to be for collection. I called the waste management company and confirmed that the truck hadn't reached my street until 4:52 p.m. that day. Sharon had photographed my garbage cans 15 minutes before they were collected and called it a violation. This time, I didn't wait for the board meeting. I emailed all 3 board members with my explanation, the waste management company's confirmation of collection time, and a polite but firm statement that this appeared to be targeted harassment following my successful challenge of the previous violation. Bob responded first. "Thank you for the clarification. This violation will be dismissed. I apologize for the inconvenience." Linda sent a similar message. Sharon didn't respond at all, but the violations kept coming. Over the next month, I received notices for my mailbox being slightly faded and needing repainting, for having a ladder visible in my garage when the door was open, and for parking my truck at an angle in my driveway rather than straight. Each violation was either completely invalid or a ridiculous interpretation of vague bylaws language. Each one I contested with documentation and clear logic. Each one was eventually dismissed by Bob and Linda, with Sharon voting to uphold the fines. By mid-March, I was getting tired of the games. I'd done nothing wrong, followed all legitimate rules, and yet I was spending hours every week dealing with Sharon's manufactured violations. Other neighbors mentioned they were seeing the same pattern, Sharon cracking down on minor or invented infractions against anyone she perceived as a threat to her authority. That's when Ed suggested I run for the board. "Elections are in May," Ed said. We were standing in his driveway on a Saturday morning, watching his grandson ride a bike in circles. "Sharon's position is up for re-election. You should run against her." "I don't want to be on the HOA board. I barely want to be in an HOA." Nobody wants to be on the board, which is why people like Sharon end up in charge. She's got time and motivation, but if enough people are fed up, they'll vote for someone reasonable. You run. You've been here longer. I'm 72 years old and I don't need the stress. You're young, you're articulate, and you just proved you can stand up to her. People notice that. I thought about it. The idea of spending more time on HOA politics made me want to bang my head against a wall. But the idea of another 2 years of Sharon inventing violations and making everyone miserable was worse. If I run, I'm running on a platform of reasonable enforcement and minding our own business, I said. That'll win in a landslide, Ed said. The next week, I submitted my name for the ballot. HOA elections in Meadowbrook Estates were straightforward. Candidates submitted their names, provided a short statement for the newsletter, and then residents voted by mail and ballot over a 2-week period in May. My candidate statement was simple. I'm Griffin Ortega, and I believe the HOA should focus on maintaining our community infrastructure and enforcing clear, reasonable rules. I'll work to ensure all residents are treated fairly and that bylaws are applied consistently and sensibly. Our neighborhood is made up of good people who deserve an HOA that serves them, not one that hassles them over minor issues. Sharon's statement was longer and filled with phrases like protecting property values and maintaining standards of excellence and vigilant stewardship of our community. It read like she was running for mayor of a major city rather than for an HOA board position. The newsletter went out in late April, and I started hearing from neighbors. Some stopped me in the street to say they were voting for me. Others emailed or called. The common theme was that people were tired of the nitpicking and wanted someone more reasonable. But Sharon wasn't taking the challenge lying down. She began campaigning, which apparently wasn't against the rules, though it felt strange for an HOA election. She went door to door, talking about her vision for the community and subtly suggesting that I was trying to undermine community standards. One evening in early May, Sharon showed up at my door. I'd just gotten home from work and was still in my dusty work clothes when I answered the doorbell. "Mr. Ortega," she said, her smile tight and artificial, "I thought we should talk neighbor to neighbor." "About what?" "About the election, of course. I understand you're challenging my position." "I'm running for the board, yes. That's not a challenge to you personally. That's participating in the democratic process. Democracy works best when people understand what they're getting into," Sharon said. "The board requires significant time and dedication. It's not something to take lightly." "I don't take it lightly. I think the HOA needs better leadership." Her smile vanished. Better leadership. I've maintained this community's standards for 2 years. Property values have increased. We've had no major issues. We've had plenty of issues, most of them created by overzealous enforcement of rules that don't exist. I enforce the bylaws as they're meant to be enforced. You enforce your interpretation of the bylaws in ways that harass residents. Sharon's eyes narrowed. Is that what you think? That I'm harassing people? When you photograph someone's garbage cans 15 minutes before collection time and call it a violation, yes, that's harassment. When you try to fine someone for warming up their truck with an emissions test proving no environmental violation, that's harassment. I'm protecting the community. From what? From people living their lives in reasonable ways. Sharon stepped back, her face flushed. You'll regret this. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Is that a threat? It's a fact. This community needs strong leadership, not someone who wants to let everything slide into chaos. She turned and walked away before I could respond. I closed the door, my heart pounding with frustration. Ed was right about Sharon not forgetting challenges to her authority, and now I directly challenged her position on the board. The next morning, I found a new violation notice on my door. This one claimed that I had unauthorized modifications to my property's exterior. According to the notice, I'd installed a satellite dish without HOA approval, violating Section 5, Paragraph 8 regarding exterior modifications. I didn't have a satellite dish. I'd never had a satellite dish. I used cable internet and streaming services. I took photos of my entire house exterior from every angle, showing clearly that there was no satellite dish anywhere. Then, I emailed the board with the photos and a statement that this violation was completely false and appeared to be retaliation for my running for Sharon's board position. Bob called me within an hour. "Griffin, I'm sorry about this. The violation has been dismissed. Linda and I are both concerned about the pattern of violations you've been receiving." "It's targeted harassment," I said. Sharon is abusing her position. I agree, but I'm not sure what we can do about it before the election. If she's voted out, the problem resolves itself. And if she's not voted out, Bob sighed, then we'll need to have a serious conversation about board conduct. Linda and I have been discussing it. This isn't how the HOA is supposed to function. The election took place over the first 2 weeks of May, with ballots mailed to all residents and due back by May 14th. The vote count was scheduled for May 16th at a special board meeting. Those 2 weeks felt longer than they should have. I kept my routine normal, going to work, maintaining my house, warming up my truck on the few cold mornings we had left. Every day I half expected another bogus violation notice, but none came. Maybe Sharon realized she'd pushed too far, or maybe she was focused on campaigning. On May 16th, I arrived at the community center at 7 p.m. to find a much larger crowd than usual. Apparently, the contentious election had drawn interest. Nearly 40 residents were present, filling all the chairs and forcing some people to stand along the walls. Sharon sat at the board table with Bob and Linda, her expression neutral but her posture rigid. Bob called the meeting to order and quickly moved to the election results. We received a total of 127 ballots out of 198 eligible households, Bob announced. That's a 64% turnout, significantly higher than our usual 30%. For the position currently held by Sharon Patterson, the results are as follows. Sharon Patterson received 52 votes. Griffin Ortega received 75 votes. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a wave of relief and anxiety hit me simultaneously. I'd won. I'd actually won, which meant I was now on the HOA board and would have to actually deal with all the issues I'd been criticizing. Sharon's face had gone pale, then red. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. "Congratulations, Mr. Ortega. I hope you're ready for the responsibility you've taken on." "Thank you," I said, trying to be gracious. "I look forward to working with the board to serve the community." Sharon didn't respond. She left the meeting immediately, walking out without another word. Several residents watched her go, then turned their attention back to the front. Bob smiled. "Well, that brings us to new business. Griffin, why don't you come up and take your seat?" I walked to the front and sat in the chair Sharon had vacated. It felt surreal. 3 months ago, I'd just been a guy trying to warm up his truck before work. Now I was on the HOA board. The rest of the meeting covered standard business items but with a different tone than previous meetings. Bob and Linda were both welcoming and helpful, explaining procedures and upcoming issues. After the meeting ended, numerous neighbors congratulated me and expressed hope that things would improve. Ed was one of the last to approach me. "You did it. Now comes the hard part. Running the HOA. Dealing with Sharon's aftermath. She's not going to disappear quietly." Ed was right, but not in the way I expected. Over the next few weeks, as I settled into my board position and we worked on standard community issues like landscaping contracts and pool maintenance for the summer season, I discovered some concerning patterns in the HOA's finances. As a new board member, I had access to all the HOA's records and accounts. While reviewing the budget and expenditures, I noticed several payments that seemed odd. There were multiple charges to a company called Premium Community Services for various maintenance and consulting fees, totaling over $15,000 in the past year. I asked Bob about it during our monthly budget review in early June. Premium Community Services. Bob frowned, checking his notes. "I'm not immediately familiar with that vendor. They show up regularly in the payments. Consulting fees, administrative support, community assessment services. but I can't find any contracts or documentation about what services they actually provided." Linda pulled up the records on her laptop. "That's strange. I don't remember approving these payments. Bob, do you?" "No. Sharon handled most of the day-to-day finances. I just reviewed the overall budget quarterly." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Do we have contact information for this company?" Bob searched through the files. "There's an address listed. Post office box in Akron." Over the next week, I dug deeper. I called the phone number listed for premium community services and got a disconnected number message. I searched for the company online and found no website, no listings, no business registration with the state of Ohio. I even drove to the post office box address in Akron and confirmed it was a mail rental facility. Premium community services didn't appear to exist as a legitimate business. I brought my findings to an emergency board meeting with just Bob and Linda present. I laid out all the documentation. 15 months of payments totaling $15,750. No contracts, no service records, no legitimate business entity, and all payments authorized by Sharon during her time managing the day-to-day finances. "This looks like embezzlement," Linda said quietly. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," I said, "but we need to investigate. If Sharon was funneling HOA money to a fake company, that's theft. That's our neighbor's money." Bob looked sick. "We need to contact an attorney and possibly the police." We hired a forensic accountant recommended by the HOA's attorney. Over the next 3 weeks, the accountant traced the payments and discovered that Premium Community Services was a business entity registered to Sharon's daughter, Melissa Patterson, in 2023. The business had no legitimate operations, no employees except Melissa as the registered agent, and no services actually provided to Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. The money paid to Premium Community Services had been deposited into an account controlled by Melissa Patterson, and from there, the money was transferred to Sharon's personal accounts. It was a straightforward embezzlement scheme. Sharon had created fake invoices for services never rendered, approved the payments herself, and funneled the money through her daughter's shell company into her own pocket. The total amount stolen was $15,750 over 15 months. Our attorney advised us to file a police report immediately. On July 8th, I met with Bob, Linda, our attorney, and a detective from the Shaker Heights Police Department at the police station. We provided all the documentation, the forensic accountant's report, and a timeline of the theft. Detective Morrison, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the materials carefully. "This is pretty clear-cut," she said. "Fraudulent invoices, shell company, money transferred to personal accounts. We'll open an investigation and contact Mrs. Patterson and her daughter." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll interview them, give them a chance to explain, but based on this evidence, we'll likely be filing charges. This is theft in office for an HOA board member, which is taken seriously. The amounts involved make it a 4th-degree felony." The investigation moved faster than I expected. Sharon and Melissa were both interviewed within a week. According to Detective Morrison, Sharon initially denied everything, then claimed the payments were for legitimate consulting services she'd provided to the HOA beyond her normal duties. When pressed for documentation of these services, she couldn't provide any. Melissa admitted under questioning that Premium Community Services had never performed any work for the HOA, and that the money had been transferred to her mother. She claimed Sharon had told her it was deferred salary Sharon was owed, but Melissa had no documentation supporting that claim. On July 22nd, Sharon Patterson was arrested and charged with theft in office and fraud. Melissa was charged as an accessory. Both were released on bail pending trial. The news spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. Neighbors were shocked, angry, and in some cases, vindicated. Many residents had felt Sharon's heavy-handed enforcement was about control and power, and the revelation that she'd been stealing from the HOA confirmed their worst suspicions. I received dozens of emails and messages from neighbors thanking me for uncovering the theft. Some people felt betrayed, having trusted Sharon to manage the community's finances. Others wanted to know if we'd recover the stolen money. The HOA's attorney filed a civil lawsuit against Sharon and Melissa Patterson to recover the funds. The criminal case moved through the court system over the following months, with Sharon's attorney trying to negotiate a plea deal. In October, Sharon pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and probation. She was ordered to repay the $15,750 to the HOA, perform 200 hours of community service, and serve 2 years of probation. Melissa received a suspended sentence and probation in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. The money was repaid in full by December, with Sharon liquidating some assets to cover the amount. She and her daughter both moved out of Meadowbrook Estates, and I never saw either of them again. Throughout all of this, I continued serving on the HOA board with Bob and Linda. We implemented new financial controls, requiring dual approval for all expenditures over $500 and quarterly audits by an independent accountant. We also revised several bylaws to make them clearer and less subject to interpretation, including adding specific language about vehicle idling. The new idling rule was reasonable. Vehicles could idle for up to 15 minutes for warming up or cooling down, as needed, without violation. Anything beyond that, for non-emergency reasons, would be considered excessive. It was common sense written into the bylaws, protecting residents while still maintaining community standards. By the time winter rolled around again, life in Meadowbrook Estates had settled into a comfortable routine. The HOA focused on legitimate issues like snow removal, maintaining common areas, and planning community events. There were no more bogus violation notices, no more harassment, no more power trips. On a cold morning in January, almost exactly a year after Sharon had filmed my truck idling, I started my F-150 in the driveway and let it warm up while I finished my coffee inside. Through the window, I watched the exhaust puff white clouds into the frigid air, and I smiled. My truck was warm, my coffee was hot, and my HOA was functioning the way it should have been all along. Sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority led to more responsibility than you planned for, but it was worth it when the outcome made life better for everyone. Ed walked by with his dog, a golden retriever named Murphy, and waved. I waved back, grabbed my work bag, and headed out to my warm truck. The roads were clear, the sun was just coming up, and I had a construction site waiting for me. Life was good. The whole saga had taught me something valuable. Communities work best when people stand up for common sense and hold leaders accountable. Sharon's downfall wasn't just about the stolen money, though that was serious. It was about a pattern of behavior that put personal power above community service, that used rules as weapons rather than guidelines, and that ultimately crossed the line into criminal conduct. When I arrived at the job site that morning, Tommy asked how things were going with the HOA situation. I'd kept him updated throughout the investigation and legal proceedings. All resolved, I said. Sharon pled guilty, paid restitution, and moved away. The HOA is back to normal, normal meaning boring, normal meaning functional, which is exactly what an HOA should be. "You still on the board?" "Yeah, I've got another year in my term. After that, I might step down. But for now, it's not too bad. We meet once a month, deal with actual issues, and nobody's inventing violations." Tommy laughed. "From truck idling to HOA board member to catching a thief. That's quite a year. Tell me about it." "All I wanted to do was warm up my truck. But looking back, I was glad things had played out the way they did. If I'd just paid that first bogus fine, Sharon would have continued her pattern of manufactured violations and petty tyranny. The theft might have gone undiscovered for years, with tens of thousands more dollars stolen. Other residents would have continued being harassed over minor or invented infractions. Instead, standing up for a reasonable interpretation of the rules had led to positive change. The emissions test proving my truck passed everything had been a small victory that started a larger chain of events, ultimately revealing corruption and improving the community for everyone. The legal proceedings wrapped up completely by March of that year, with all restitution paid and the civil case settled. The HOA used the recovered funds to make improvements to the community park, installing new playground equipment and benches. It felt right, turning the stolen money into something positive for all the residents, especially the kids who played there. Spring came to Meadowbrook Estates with the usual burst of activity. Lawn mowers appeared on weekends, flower beds were planted, and the community pool opened for the season. The HOA's spring newsletter, which I helped write, focused on upcoming events and reminders about maintenance season. There were no harsh warnings, no threats of fines, just helpful information and neighborly communication. At a board meeting in April, we reviewed the violation reports for the previous quarter. There had been exactly 3 legitimate violations. One for an abandoned vehicle on the street, which was resolved when the owner got it towed for repairs. One for overgrown landscaping, which the owner trimmed after a friendly reminder. And one noise complaint about a late-night party, which was handled with a warning. 3 violations in 3 months, all resolved cooperatively. Compare that to Sharon's tenure, when there were sometimes a dozen violations per month, most of them questionable or outright manufactured. "This is what success looks like," Bob said, reviewing the report. "Minimal issues, cooperative resolution, no drama. Boring is good," Linda agreed. "HOAs should be boring." I couldn't have said it better myself. My term on the board ended the following May, and I chose not to run for re-election. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do: restore sanity to the HOA and ensure proper financial controls. A woman named Patricia volunteered to take my place, a retired teacher with a level-headed approach and no apparent desire for petty power. At my last board meeting, Bob presented me with a plaque thanking me for my service. It was a nice gesture, though completely unnecessary. Several neighbors attended the meeting to express their appreciation, which was touching and a little embarrassing. "You fixed things when they needed fixing," Ed said afterward. "That's all anyone can ask." "I just wanted to warm up my truck," I said, which got a laugh, but it was true. The entire situation had started with something so mundane, so ordinary, so completely reasonable, that it should never have been an issue at all. The fact that it had become an issue revealed deeper problems with how the HOA was being run, and addressing those problems had been necessary. As I drove home that night, I thought about how strange life could be. You never know which small moment will snowball into something significant. Standing in my boxer shorts and sweatshirt, watching Sharon film my truck through a frost-covered window, I had no idea that morning would eventually lead to serving on the HOA board, uncovering embezzlement, and helping reform how the community was managed. All I'd wanted was a warm truck on a cold morning. What I'd gotten was a lesson in civic responsibility, the importance of standing up for reasonable behavior, and the value of accountability in community leadership. My truck still sat in the driveway, a 2019 Ford F-150 that had inadvertently started a revolution. It ran great, passed all its emissions tests, and warmed up every cold morning without anyone filming it or threatening violations. Sometimes the smallest stands against unreasonable authority lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes defending your right to warm up your truck means defending everyone's right to live reasonably in their own homes. And sometimes, just sometimes, the system actually works the way it's supposed to when good people refuse to accept bad behavior from those in power. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was proof of that. It had gone from a source of stress and harassment to a functional community organization that actually served its residents. Property values were stable, common areas were maintained, and people felt comfortable in their own neighborhood without fear of manufactured violations. And every cold morning, all across the community, trucks and cars idled in driveways for reasonable amounts of time, warming up before their owners drove to work. It was such a simple thing, such a normal part of winter life in Ohio, and now it was protected by clear, sensible rules rather than subject to arbitrary enforcement. I thought about Sharon sometimes, wondering how she justified her actions to herself. Had she believed she was entitled to extra compensation? Had she convinced herself that the HOA owed her something beyond her volunteer position? Or had it simply been opportunistic theft, taking advantage of lax oversight and her position of trust? I'd never know, and ultimately it didn't matter. What mattered was that the theft had been discovered, addressed, and corrected. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Years later, I still lived in Meadowbrook Estates. I'd paid off a good chunk of my mortgage, made improvements to the house, and become genuinely involved in the community. Not in an overbearing way like Sharon, but in a normal neighborly way. I knew people's names, helped with community events occasionally, and kept my property maintained. The HOA continued functioning smoothly under various board members, all of whom seemed to understand that their role was service, not power. Bylaws were enforced reasonably, disputes were handled fairly, and the community remained a pleasant place to live. My truck eventually got replaced with a newer model, a 2024 F-150 that had even better emissions controls and fuel efficiency. I still warmed it up on cold mornings, now without a second thought about whether someone might be filming it or inventing violations. The whole experience had taught me that institutions, even small ones like HOAs, are only as good as the people running them and the oversight they receive. When good people stay engaged, speak up against unreasonable actions, and hold leaders accountable, communities function well. When people disengage and allow petty tyrants to operate unchecked, problems multiply. I'd learned that standing up for yourself often means standing up for others who might not have the time, resources, or confidence to fight their own battles. Every bogus violation I'd contested had made it easier for the next person to push back against unreasonable enforcement. Every document I'd provided, every emissions test I'd taken, every board meeting I'd attended had chipped away at a culture of petty authoritarianism. And I'd learned that sometimes the most mundane situations reveal the most important principles. Warming up a truck shouldn't be a revolutionary act, but in a community ruled by someone who valued control over common sense, it had become one. The plaque Bob gave me still hung in my home office, a reminder of that strange year when I'd gone from annoyed homeowner to HOA board member to amateur detective uncovering embezzlement. It was a conversation starter when people visited, and the story never got old in the telling. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the plaque or the story. It was in knowing that Meadowbrook Estates was a better place because people had refused to accept unreasonable behavior as normal. It was in seeing neighbors live comfortably in their homes without fear of harassment. It was in watching kids play on equipment bought with recovered stolen funds, turning something negative into something positive. And it was in the simple act of warming up my truck on cold mornings, secure in the knowledge that reasonable behavior was protected, that rules meant what they actually said, and that community leadership served the community rather than personal ego. Sometimes you don't set out to change things. Sometimes things just need changing, and you happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right combination of stubbornness and documentation. Sometimes defending your right to idle your truck for 7 minutes on a 14-degree morning leads to uncovering corruption and reforming a broken system. Life in Meadowbrook Estates continued, season by season, with all the normal rhythms of suburban community life. There were new families moving in, long-time residents moving out, children growing up, and the constant small dramas of people living in proximity. But through it all, the HOA remained functional, reasonable, and drama-free. That was the real victory. Not the election, not catching the thief, not even vindicating myself against false violations. The real victory was boring, functional governance that allowed people to focus on their lives rather than on battling their own community organization. And every winter morning, as I started my truck and watched the exhaust puff into the cold air, I appreciated that simple normalcy more than I ever had before. Because I knew firsthand how quickly reasonable expectations could be turned into violations, how easily petty authority could escalate into harassment, and how important it was to stand up for common sense when it was under attack. My truck idled. The emissions test results somewhere in my files proved it passed everything, and life went on exactly as it should. And that, in the end, was exactly the point.